Welcome to another dispatch from Hollie and McKay. We are going to Ukraine today to meet Yaromir Bukiv, who
Yes.
is in the Ukrainian army and is Russian. Tell us more about these Russians that are fighting on Ukraine's side, Hollie.
Yes. Well, I met with several Russian nationals who are actually fighting on the side of Ukraine. So Yaromir isn't a complete anomaly. And I really thought it was interesting to talk to some of these soldiers to find out their stories and why they're essentially, joining the other side to fight against their own countrymen. So let's start with Yaromir a little bit. So he left Russia about 8.5 years ago, and that was pretty much just after Moscow annexed Crimea in early 2014. And he really started backing Ukraine back then because he saw that annexation as being completely wrong. But mind you, his sort of disagreements with Putin and his sort of growing hatred for the Kremlin really started long before that. So he was a graduate of a military high school in Russia, and he went to an aviation academy in the early 80s, studied engineering, and then went on to run sort of multiple small businesses after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992. And he really depicts that period, which is quite different to a lot of Russians who experienced a lot of hardship after the fall of the Soviet Union. He really depicts that period as being free. And it was the first time in his life that he recounts sort of just being able to start a business and kind of run on his own trajectory despite the poverty that the country was in. But then, of course, Putin came to power in 1999. And as he said to me, we understood very quickly that a terrorist and gangster, very strong words, and murderer had come to power in Russia. And we understood that the worst had happened in Russia. So he was sort of a very long-standing critic and very much on the radar of the FSB, which is the Kremlin's intelligence wing. So eventually he did flee across that border and go into Ukraine in 2014. And so he first served as a volunteer in what is known as the Azov Regiment, and that's a special operations detachment. And that formed throughout that sort of initial conflict in the East. And that was made up of several other Russians as well. But he's also really described that it was a process of having the Ukrainians really learn to trust him. How did the Ukrainians know he isn't a spy? How did the Ukrainians know that he might not turn against them? So it certainly was really a long process of trust that he said that he really built over time. And he said he was about one in about 10 other Russians that were part of that Azov unit. But even there, he sort of says his family was, constantly harassed. They were visited, by the FSB, and he, described some of the guilt along with that. And then, of course, when the full-scale escalation happened earlier this year, he went on to join the territorial defenses. He said, he had to go and seek out his own gun. He found his own machine gun. But some of the sort of scenes that he really described from that war, having already been fighting in the war, were just really heart-rendering, I think. And just the sort of the level of brutality they sort of said that he witnessed, and picking up the dead body of children, and it was a really heartbreaking, very personal account he had of being in the conflict for this long.
Yeah. So, and this process of his, it's very interesting because when you talk to a lot of Russians that went through the fall of the Soviet Union and the period in the rise to power of Vladimir Putin, they the variety of stories that you run into in terms of what happened to people, people falling from their positions, people finding new opportunities, and then eventually universally becoming untrusting of their own government over time. In the other people that were also there that you talked to that were Russian, did you see the same kind of gradual essentially migration to this attitude that caused them to actually fight against their very own country?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is really just sort of a very much a personal grievances that they had with Putin himself. I think that these men, they don't necessarily hate their country. They want to be able to return someday. They know that obviously right now they're enemies of the state, and they can't do that. But I do think it's interesting because it's really is taking it to another level when you are actively fighting against your countrymen. It's sort of one thing to, I guess, go and seek political asylum in another country, and then it's another to really take up arms against your own country. And I guess for them, we could debate the ins and outs of that all day, but I guess for them, they felt as though going elsewhere to seek political asylum, it just wasn't enough. That they needed to do more to stop their own country from what they see as a massive encroachment on a neighbor. I also want to share the story a little bit of another Russian that I spoke to that was fighting, and his name was Oleg Butasin. And again, he told me he was born in 1971, he lived in a village, and he went to the nautical school. There seems to be sort of a theme with people who went and studied these sort of trades like engineering, also mixed with with military as well. And he got his degree in navigation, and he really is someone who speaks very poetically and long, very long-winded monologues, and is deeply, deeply religious, and you're constantly referring to the Bible and pulling out Bible verses to sort of explain and justify a lot of his movements. He said that, by the mid-80s, he was very much a convinced anti-Soviet. So this is before the fall of the Soviet Union, and he was very much against sort of the totalitarian nature of the Soviet Union. And he really describes it as, he says, he realized that the USSR was not Russia, but he wasn't necessarily anti-Russia. Again, he was anti sort of what the USSR stood for. And so he said in the 90s too, he left the seafaring world, and he also worked privately and ran his own companies. He had transportation companies. He was a farmer. He had to this day had 12 children, which unfortunately he has lost 2 in the war this year. 2 of his sons that were also fighting with him in Ukraine were both killed in battle, which was very sad, and they were sort of fighting beneath him in their early 20s. But he really, if you read the article, he goes on to sort of talk about how he was in charge of, supreme military commander of these Cossack armies, and so very much from the beginning, he was against everything that the Kremlin stood for, and he had the FSB at his door very constantly, again throughout his life, and also in 2014, it was a little bit later for him. It was in the summer. He had a discussion with his family. They were living near the Black Sea, and then decided that things were really only going to get downhill for him in Russia from there, and so that they migrated across the border, and that's when he, sought out being able to take up arms in the East, and that was in January of 2015. So he's really been kind of in a constant state of battle, if you will. And again, his stories really describing some of the scenes in the sort of after the invasion this year, and being down in the Donbass, and then being in other parts of the country, with his 2 children, and then, having to kind of find their bodies in the rubble, is really, I think it just brings home, regardless of where you sit on this war, it brings home just the nature of what a war is, and how tragic it is. And we don't hear so much about the war in Ukraine anymore. It's been more than 6 months, and our attention tends to wane, but it's still very much going on, and people are dying there every day on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting that these guys all came in around the time of the annexation of Crimea. And did they say anything about that there's more sentiment in Russia that feels the same way that they do? Or is this something, are they the exception, not the rule?
I do think, I can't speak for all Russians, of course, but I do think that they are the exception, not the rule. I think that within Russia, Putin still has a massive support system. The sanctions haven't really hurt Russia the way that I think a lot of people assumed that it would in the beginning. I think that the propaganda campaigns from the Kremlin have worked tremendously. So I do think Russians are very much sheltered from the reality of what's happening there. So I do think that their very anti-Putin sentiment is not the norm in Russia. But again, there is quite a contingency of Russians that are out in the Ukraine battlefields. And also what I learned is there's this entire community of Russians living in exile in Lithuania, where many of them are applying for political asylum and sort of fled either before the full-scale invasion or in the weeks after it. And so there's quite a community there, and they wanted to reach out and have their story told, and they wanted it to be known that not everybody in Russia is for this war, and some people are really going to the extreme to fight back.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting vignette of the tapestry of humanity that exists in a war and what their motivations are, where they come from. And and these people certainly reflect a penchant for peace that seems to be lacking from the region at the moment, as people kind of try to reset the border between where the West ends and the East begins in Europe. So very interesting to see that there's there's real people inside of these conflicts, and so we thank you for that. Thank you, Holly, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.